I'll now call on Mr. Pat Larkin to make your opening statement, and once again of CEO of Ward Solutions. Thank you very much for making yourselves available at such short notice. Mr. Ward, you roughly have 5 minutes. Mr. Larkin, rather, CEO of Ward Solutions. Mr. Larkin, you roughly have 5 minutes. Thanks, Mr. Larkin.
Cathaoirleach, committee members, it is my pleasure to be welcomed here today. I'm Chief Executive and Co-founder of Ward Solutions, one of the largest Indigenous dedicated cybersecurity companies in Ireland. At Ward, we spend our time helping a wide range of commercial, public sector, government and other organisations from a wide variety of sectors on the island of Ireland to secure their people, systems and data from malicious and inadvertent threats. Prior to that, I had the privilege to serve my country as an officer of the Irish Defence Forces at home and overseas with the UN. Since our foundation in 1999, we've witnessed a number of things that are relevant to the committee's purpose here today. Ireland's citizens, organisations and society have transformed to a sophisticated and prosperous digital economy with a very significant digital dependency. Significant technology and born in the cloud sectors emerge both indigenously and through FDI to a point where Ireland now hosts upward of 30% of European cloud data in data centres located on island. The dramatic digital transformation of traditional bricks and mortar organisations, including government, to a very high digital dependency based on accessing and servicing their markets via digital channels. A lot of business and wealth now located in Ireland has digital roots and hence is much more portable as distinct from the less portable legacy business. This portable business and wealth can easily relocate to countries who are in a position to appropriately secure it. In the field of cybersecurity, we have witnessed the following. The emergence of cybersecurity on global, national and corporate risk registers consistently as one of the top 3 risks, along with climate change and global pandemics, and the increasing occurrence of all 3 risks. Relentless increase in the scale, sophistication and effectiveness of attacks directed against individuals, organisations and the state, from criminals, hacktivists and militia, to a point where the financial scale of cybercrime at 6 trillion annually has overtaken the global illicit narcotics trade. Organisations increasingly challenged to protect themselves from inadvertent or non-malicious cyber events that similarly threaten their survival or prosperity. A global shortage of cybersecurity talent estimated to be about 3.2 million professionals by 2022. The cybersecurity market emerged as a massive opportunity for Irish companies, conservatively estimated to be worth $173 billion in 2020 and growing to $270 billion by 2026. The emergence of a vibrant cybersecurity ecosystem in both the Republic of Ireland and simultaneously in Northern Ireland. We work with our clients through their full cybersecurity lifecycle of assess, protect, detect and respond. And there's one absolute observable trend that we and our industry generally notice. Clients who invest and adopt a systemic approach to their cybersecurity posture, working to move from an immature approach to a fully optimized approach, suffer from the same hostile environment, but are typically breached less. When breached, optimized clients respond quicker and better, and thus suffer less impact and cost to their business. Cyber-optimized organizations treat cybersecurity as a journey, not a destination. Ireland now needs a fundamental acceleration of our approach to national cybersecurity. We have a society worth defending. We need politically and societally to move to a national defence mindset, with our national cybersecurity as one of the key pillars of our defence. We need to move to leading and developing national and global consensus, collaboration on cyber law, norms, ethics and behaviour, and the global enforcement of same. We need a full-blooded, joined-up, coherent and committed strategy for our defence, encompassing all government, national security and intelligence, industry, academic and research resources to outgun the cyber bad actors. We need to adopt a 10-year goal of making Ireland the cybersecurity capital of Europe. We can do this by developing a world-class cybersecurity ecosystem in Ireland so that we have the resources in-country to secure ourselves. In doing so, Ireland also stands the possibility of benefiting from a rapidly growing cyber marketplace estimated to be worth $270 billion by 2026. We need to raise our game nationally from an immature to an optimised approach to cybersecurity to protect our citizens, our government and our economy. Thank you.
Very much, Mr. Larkin. We'll now move to Mr. Padraig O'Reilly, co-founder and Chief Products Officer of CyberSaint, and you're coming from the US. And we thank you very much, Mr. Riley, for taking the time to be with us today. Look forward to your contribution. Approximately 5 minutes, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, slightly
Very
raised,
good.
Anthony.
So a pleasure to be here today. Thanks for the invite. I'll just start by saying that the Colonial Pipeline attack, if it was in the news over there, shook up a large portion of American society, really hits individuals where they live, escalating prices for gas, its direct impact to the citizenry. We have also over here health services that are getting attacked. We don't have a national health service, but we have the Scripps Hospital concern in San Diego right now, struggling with ransomware. And we had over 200 attacks on hospital chains last year as well. I would say that my background, just to talk a little bit about myself and my perspective, I started a company 5 years ago with the Chief Information Security Officer of Schneider Electric. It's primarily his expertise was in OT and cyber and OT operational technology. My expertise was in financial modeling, and I've built out a software product that operationalizes regulations, standards like the NIST directive. And what I've seen from inside my concern across many sectors is in accordance with what I just heard, which is that there's some variance with respect to maturity. Work in depth with the energy industry, the finance industry, across almost every sector. What we see with the increase in ransomware is quite alarming with respect to just the frequency and the increasing ransoms. So maturity levels vary greatly. In the Pipeline Colonial attack, the learnings we're dealing with here in the States, the administration here came out immediately with an executive order that sought to address some of the gaps that still remain. And we have a sprawling sort of regulatory regime here. So when I work with the energy industry, they're under something we call NERC-CIP, which is really a legacy set of standards that relate to the grid. The actual pipeline industry is under a voluntary set of standards. So there's real variance between practitioners and companies within the energy industry. And you can see the results quite clearly. We don't see that the organizations under strictly voluntary standards do a great deal of adoption. That's not the case for all of them, of course. But what we've learned, I think, over here with the threat of going from cyber to physical in the pipeline industry hack is that the government is now reevaluating, and the Department of Energy is reevaluating whether or not to actively police or regulate the pipelines. So it's always a question. And the question really comes down to, we have 85% of our public infrastructure in private hands. Private infrastructure companies tend to live quarter to quarter. They don't always put into practice some of the standards that are quite clear. When I was on television talking last week, there was quite a gap in understanding, I think, around what one does with respect to cyber. People tend to think, wow, it's very expensive. It's extremely expensive. These are complicated systems, and it's so expensive. There are many things that are done in cyber that are practice and policy oriented and employment oriented that are not overwhelmingly expensive. Best practices are not always terribly expensive. The pipeline attack looks like it was an RDP attack. An RDP attack, you can throw two-factor authentication and do some other things with RDP that make it much harder for brute force attacks. There's no way to know, though, if you don't have metrics. So we can talk about standards, we can talk about best practices, but there have to also be metrics. And when the NIST directive came into play, there was an actual colloquium down in Washington, D.C. around metrics. So it was essentially taking the cybersecurity framework, which we operationalize in our software and driving metrics over it. It was very controversial. A lot of industries don't want metrics. They don't want to be measured. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So I would just end by saying that, when I'm watching what you're going through with the health service.
Mr. O'Reilly, can you define what can you just put, I know it's going in, you speak about metrics, just give us an example of what you deem to be an example of a metric measurement.
So very simple one that I talked to Adam Sedgwick, who was the head of NIST at the time, is just scoring how you're doing. Maturity, the first guest referred to a metric. Maturity is a metric. Maturity usually has several stages. So if you do something for the first time, that's called ad hoc. You could assign it a number. You could say 0.25. If the process is documented, it could be 0.5. If the process is then sort of reviewed and then redocumented, 0.75, and the like.
Or you can continue with your
Sure.
presentation.
Yeah, I would just end by saying that looking across at what you're going through with the health service, you have our attention and sympathy. That's why I wanted to join here today. We're dealing with this across our hospitals as well. They're more distributed, obviously, than yours are. But our hospital chains and HMOs are all very vulnerable to ransomware, as are our states and local and municipalities. The Washington, D.C. police are undergoing this at the moment. So, I've been quite busy just talking in general to individuals around these issues. And, I wanted to make sure I came here today, and I really appreciate the opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you. We look forward to putting questions to Mr. O'Reilly. We'll now move to Caroline. Ms. Caroline, you're an expert in cybersecurity, particularly on the recruitment expert side. So we'd like to hear your opening statement and just give us, obviously, in the context of director position is currently vacant in the National Cybersecurity Centre, and just roughly that type of a role, what that role actually involves. So thanks very much for joining us, and approximately 5 minutes, Ms. Caroline.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning, Chairman and Committee, and thank you for inviting me here today. So I'm attending in an advisory capacity, as mentioned, to support with the recruitment of this extremely important new position of the Director of Cyber Security, the DCS, with the National Cyber Security Centre. It's worth mentioning this role will be recognised nationally as Chief Information Officer. It's relevant for what I'll talk about next. And I've been invited here today in my capacity as a professional and seasoned Human Resource Director, bringing over 15 years of expertise in recruitment, particularly for senior and executive roles, spanning across technology, high-tech and blue-chip companies, both in Ireland and internationally. From the outset, I believe that we all acknowledge the role of the Director of Cybersecurity must be on the executive level team and board, where business decisions amongst the executive team will be discussed and agreed and together where they're decided upon. This is a new critical hire for the National Cyber Security Centre. The seniority and accountability of this role cannot be understated. The Director of Cybersecurity will be at the forefront of the National Cyber Security Centre to drive and influence right decisions on security, strategy, infrastructure, programmes, people, behaviours and so on in developing a sustainable and scalable, secure model. The gravitas and accountability that comes with this new role defines the calibre of candidate that we need here. This role demands the best-in-class hire, meaning we must provide every opportunity to the National Cybersecurity Centre to hire the very best, most qualified, proven candidate, and one who's capable to deliver on an international level. If we are to hire for success, we need to hire expertise in this field, most likely attracting from the public sector. Therefore, the remuneration of this role must be competitive. If we are to fill this role, we must apply the salary range and benchmarking of the private market sector. And we recognise that we are in a time where the job market is extremely competitive. We've seen a lot of movement, particularly at senior level roles, particularly this year where there's been a huge lift in confidence in people moving. With all of this in mind, the benchmarking of this current market data for this role, the Director of Cybersecurity, or indeed Chief Information Officer, provides for a basic salary ranging between 220 to 290,000 euros per annum, plus benefits including bonus, long-term incentive plans, stock options, combined with a benefits package ranging between 150 to 200,000 per annum. And I think it's worth mentioning also that we are seeing other varied and flexible benefits, for example, a one-time sign-on bonus for executive hires up to a range of 20,000 euros. Everything hinges on getting this hire right to ensure a sustainable and secure success of our National Cybersecurity Centre. We need to get the package right to ensure we hire the right calibre to this role. Once we've the package defined, we need to ensure the process is immediately defined and roll smooth, which will include branding the role, driving positive branding through social media, newspapers and other such channels, using our networks to reach out to and attract suitable calibre of candidates, ensuring the interview process is defined and clear from the outset to ensure it runs smooth and it runs efficiently through a thoughtful process, bearing in mind that we are competing against a very fast external market and candidates are hired and move quickly through processes. And I would recommend that we really meet this head on to ensure we hire the best in class candidate and hire them through these doors. Chairman and committee, thank you once again for inviting me here today.
Thanks very much, Ms. Carroll. You've certainly given us food for thought. Your range of 220 to 290 is far off the 89,000 euro being mentioned in the media and being reported on. And we look forward to questioning you in that regard. We'll now move to Mr. Walsh, who is going to speak on behalf of Cyber Ireland. Mr. Walsh is the Chair of Cyber Ireland. Once again, Mr. Walsh, to both yourself and your colleague, Mr. Byrne, we thank you for coming at such short notice. But we deem we're at a critical time in terms of cyber security, and more particularly the state itself in terms of its protection. So roughly, Mr. Walsh, you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre-Luc. Committee members, it is my pleasure to be here today along with my colleague, Dr. Owen Byrne, our cluster manager. I am the chairperson of Cyber Ireland, the National Cybersecurity Cluster Organisation, which brings together industry, academia and government to represent the needs of the cybersecurity ecosystem in Ireland and address key challenges for industry. We aim to enhance the innovation, growth and competitiveness of the companies and organisations which are part of the cluster. Today we have over 120 members nationwide, comprising of 40 multinationals, 60 Irish SMEs and 12 of the leading academic institutes with their partners in government, including the National Cybersecurity Centre, IDA Ireland and Enterprise Ireland. Our aim is to move forward Ireland's cybersecurity agenda and advocate for industry needs. Now more than ever, there is a need for a collaborative approach across industry, academia and government to address Ireland's cybersecurity challenges. Cybersecurity is a rapidly growing industry internationally for which there are a number of opportunities and challenges. It is estimated that cybersecurity spending will reach 248 billion euros worldwide by 2023. The annual global cost of cybercrime has exceeded 1 trillion euros. Unfilled cybersecurity jobs predicted to hit 3.2 million by 2022, and current unemployment levels are very low. There's increased global competition for talent and investment. There's increased cybercrime globally and in Ireland, and the economic impacts of cybercrime put our Indigenous SME sector at risk, and this has knock-on effects for our FDI brand. There's skill shortages globally and locally, and there's low level of collaborative security R&D between industry and academia. Ireland has become a significant base of international technology and security companies. 6 of the top 10 software security companies are here. There are over 40 multinationals with cybersecurity operations in Ireland. there are over 60 Irish cybersecurity companies and startups. Over 6,000 people are working in the cybersecurity industry, and 30,000 professionals have cybersecurity related skills. We have a strong talent pool with highly skilled multilingual workforce. We are a digital leader, attracting foreign direct investment and hosting much of Europe's data. We have a dedicated workforce with talent development programs. We believe Ireland is uniquely placed to benefit from increased global investment. It has an opportunity to position itself as a global leader for cybersecurity talent and innovation. Cyber Ireland aims to facilitate the cybersecurity ecosystem to capitalise upon this opportunity. We have a strong focus on talent and skills to ensure a sustainable pipeline of cybersecurity talent. Our Cyber Ireland Skills Report was published this February, and its key findings clearly highlight the opportunity and challenges facing our industry. Our findings tell us that in Ireland, 62% of companies will hire in 2021. Our cyber workforce is highly skilled. 48% of organizations have open or unfilled cybersecurity roles. 46% of cybersecurity teams are understaffed. 19% require 6 months or more to fill a role. 43% of new hires are from outside of Ireland. And 27% have difficulty in retaining female talent. A sustained long-term strategy is needed to address these gaps, and Cyber Ireland is focused on building a strong pipeline of talent from schools to universities to industry with their partners. We have programs in place that promote career opportunities in cyber to students through the Cyber Security Academy for secondary schools and career talks and cyber summer camps that we've planned for June. We welcome the skills initiatives that are focused on upskilling our existing workforce and attracting talent to cross-train in cybersecurity. We strongly believe that we have opportunity to be at the center of a growing global cybersecurity market, support indigenous cybersecurity SMEs and startups, be a leader in cybersecurity policy and the response to ransomware, influence Europe's investment and prioritization of cybersecurity, and create a national R&D centre along with the NCSC with a strong national security perspective. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks very much, Mr. Walsh. I might ask the witnesses if you had prepared statements that you might provide them to the clerk so that we can distribute them amongst members. Certainly, Mr. Walsh, you had figures there that would be very interesting to us about the percentages. So if you have them, just we can deal with them as we go along.
Sure.
We're now moving over to questions from members. And what I'd suggest we do is I'll give members about 7 minutes each. And if time arises thereafter, I'll just come back to the members again, just so I can accommodate everyone. So the first slot up is Sinn Féin. Is that Deputy O'Rourke's slot? So,
yeah, thanks, Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for that very useful information. And I mightn't get to question all of the guests, but I'm sure other members of the committee, just with time constraints. But thank you very much for all of the contributions. I might ask Mr. Larkin and Mr. O'Reilly, just in relation to your experience of.
Just before I won't reroad your time. Just everyone else, just go on mute. I think there's a small bit of an echo. Deputy O'Rourke.
Thank you. So Mr. Larkin and Mr. O'Reilly, just your experience of working with companies and what the difference is between a mature and immature organisation in terms of the either the mindset or the commitment or the governance structures or the regulatory structures that separates them, and what you think the 2 or 3 priorities should be for government in terms of ensuring that more companies and state bodies move from immature to mature. So maybe Mr. Larkin first.
Deputy, thank you for the question. I think there's a couple of key principles to the difference. First, I would call it a defence mindset rather than a compliance mindset. I mean, if you focus on compliance, you're just trying to achieve compliance. If you focus on defence and protecting what's important to the organisation, then you're much more centred on the robustness and resilience of the organisation. Board level involvement, top down engagement from the top level of the organisation, and a commitment to that cyber resilience and cyber security is absolutely important to the business, and that involves obviously communication upwards from then stakeholders in the business to make the board aware of that and to be transparent with them as to the exposure that they face, the maturity that they're at. And the work program that they need to undertake to achieve that resilience. I think what's really important is it's a journey, not a destination. So there is no point at which you are entirely resilient or entirely mature. You have to commit to the ongoing journey. And then back to the second speaker's point, I think you do need to bring standards into play and measurement to assess. And there are standards there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's standards like ISO 27001, which is a very well recognized standard. It puts in place an information security management system and governance in an organization. It's objectively measured and assessed by an auditor periodically. And then that builds a structure by which you can then layer in, the people, the process, and the technology controls that make an organization mature and resilient.
Okay, thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, I would agree with what the first speaker said, but just sort of add to it in a sense. What I've seen across a lot of different sectors, say, for example, the defense sector here in the States, we have hundreds of thousands of companies that supply up the chain to the primary contractors. And often when you go into a defense industrial-based company that's trying to baseline themselves on a cyber standard, they might have 2 or 3 people, if that, who are responsible for this. So on top of, sort of the IT management they're already doing, they're having to report out on a standard. Sometimes if they have a little bit of budget, they'll contract with an MSP or the like, and that'll put a process in place. But what I generally see is that might be a one-off. It doesn't then become a continuous practice. So there is a role for governance, and even at the lowest levels, some of the best companies we've worked with that are on the smaller end have direct mandates from the top to spend a budget to baseline themselves and then do some continuous improvement on a cyber standard. Some of the best ones, obviously, your NIST directive is in close alliance with the cybersecurity framework here. The CSF, certainly ISO and ISMS and other control frameworks that are called informative references. So there's a lot of good standards out there. Larger companies, that gets into big-time governance issues because in larger companies, you have many different departments. You might have compliance, you might have risk, you might have IT, you might have OT. They often talk to each other, but when we get them on calls together, they sometimes don't know what the right hand is doing and the left hand is doing. This is an issue, right? And they also have to justify spend with respect to fixing things. So they might have alarming gaps in a program and have to take that upstairs. But in order to take it upstairs, they need to make a risk-based argument. And the governance structures are not always interested. There's been a lot of talk about cyber being, central to governance in larger organizations. But at times over here, frankly, governance structures are asleep at the wheel. It takes events like this to shake them up, and it does. But then sometimes the hype cycle ends and they've moved on, right? So, education, I think, is a good thing that we're all talking about here. And I think that also applies to governance structures as well. There needs to be a little bit of tooth behind things as well, because in larger sectors, I see actual results if executive pay is sometimes tied to cyber. So we've actually seen that. My company's seen that as well. So, I think it's a complicated challenge because you've got resource-constrained companies on the smaller end. So a lot of the ransomware hacks hit smaller organizations, and that's very difficult because then it's a scramble. They might not have had even time to back things up or the resources to back things up. And that's why there's such a juicy target for attackers. And in larger companies, you've got sprawl and antiquated practices. A lot of cyber is still it's run on spreadsheets. That's a problem. You need to have central visibility for the practice of cyber inside a company, and spreadsheets do not get the job done. And a lot of large service organizations deliver on the back of spreadsheets. That's why, George and I, when we founded the company, we created a software that actually makes a central repository for the practice of cyber.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Riley. And just following on for Mr. Walsh and Ms. Carolyn, just in terms of the recruitment and retention environment that's there's been considerable discussion in terms of the relatively comparatively small number of staff in the NCSC, the lack of a director there at the minute. Maybe Mr. Walsh, if you can talk to do you share that concern? Do you have any sense from staff there, or the type of staff that those services, those centres and sectors, just in terms of the rate of retention and attrition, what are the is it a factor of pay? Is it the level of support? Is it the overall governance and commitment to the sector? And maybe Ms. Carolyn as well, if you have some sense in terms of not just at the director level, but also at other levels in terms of cybersecurity as a priority sector for government and for the state.
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Deputy O'Rourke. I suppose in relation to the NCSC, I don't really have any information or data around attrition levels there, or how that is structured. But what I can say is that, within the organisation generally in Ireland, within the industry, it's growing at a rapid pace. There's lots of additional organisations setting up in Ireland. It's becoming a strong, hub for cybersecurity activity. And that creates lots of opportunity. It brings some very critical roles to this country, but it also creates competition within organisations operating here, both kind of multinational and SMEs. So for us, the real opportunity and challenge here is to create more awareness, in the school systems and university sector, to create I suppose graduates with the skills necessary to fill these roles. And also to create opportunities for cross-training, those who are already working, who may have an interest in cybersecurity, to bolster, the need in the economy generally.
Thank you. And Ms. Carolyn? Yeah,
thank you, Deputy O'Rourke. An excellent question indeed, and, very poignant, considering, what we're seeing is very much a very competitive market right now today, and it has been going in this direction for quite a while. So, I think similar to Mr. Walsh, I don't have direct experience in the cyber security centre. Nonetheless, the nation and right across Europe, we're seeing a lot of activity, a lot of movement, partly because of last year's pandemic, which we're still in the throes of. We'd normally see 12 to 14, 15,000 people move to Ireland and, from outer countries. So that hasn't been happening. And the market space is that bit tighter, which certainly is throwing up a lot more movement across companies. It is becoming a lot more competitive. We're seeing a lot more headquarters again bolster and set up, establish in the cities here in Dublin as a really competitive place. So factors in relation in terms to retention, on a more of a human resource element, we're looking at all of the hygiene factors, all of the wellness factors, job satisfaction, are they growing in their skill set, and ensuring that those skill sets and the career opportunities are being made available to them. And that's really important to individuals. And of course, pay and the additional benefits around that are important. But it's a combination of many elements. There isn't just one there isn't just one piece, but it's a combination of multiple aspects of the employee experience. And certainly another one not to lose sight of is the accountability. And people do like and appreciate and you know, the recognition in the role and accountability that comes with that, and to grow in their role in their organisation where they are. So certainly it's a combination.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Now move to the Fianna Fáil start. Senator Dooley. Senator Dooley, approximately about 7 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chair. I won't need that because I've got to be speaking in the Senate before that. So, look, thanks very much for the presentation from all guests, and particularly our guest from the United States. I was just trying to work out which part of the States you were in and recognise that it's probably well past your bedtime. But thank you for being with us. It's really helpful. You've identified that our IT infrastructure, particularly in the health service, is under attack. And whilst to some extent we seem to know where we're going with that, the concerns that I think we have as a committee is to understand how vulnerable we are across other institutions of the state and fundamental service providers within the state, and then the wider sector. It's probably fair to say, and if my comments are incorrect, well then correct me, that larger private companies have taken this more seriously and have invested more money perhaps than state institutions and semi-state organisations. So that's something we need to look at. So my question, I suppose, really is to Mr. Larkin, in terms of your experience as a contractor in the state. Have you any kind of views that you might share with us about the state of readiness, the state of protection that exists, sort of measuring state, and you've indicated that you do some state work, the state of protection in state institutions, government departments where key data is stored, versus your experience in the private sector. And that's not to be critical, but it's just to give us some understanding of the challenge that we face. I think Ms. Carlin has addressed a point that I raised at the committee previously, which was the concerns about the position of director of that office. It seemed to me at the time that that proposed payment was far too low. And I think you've clarified that for us. So maybe just Mr. Larkin, you might respond to my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dooley. I suppose in general terms, I'd make a point that the mandate of say commercial versus public sector is slightly different, and it comes back to the point of mindset. In most cases, there's a very clear imperative. 5 years ago, we were shouting at the wind, trying to educate boards that cybersecurity was important and they should do something about it. What's happened, obviously, with you know the frequency and degree of crime and the cost to organisations is that awareness is now absolutely there. Boards are now bringing businesses like ourselves in to do cyber maturity assessments, to assess the organisation's readiness, because they're interested in protecting shareholder value. Their customers vote with their feet if they have breaches, so they lose. Apart from the direct cost of an incident like a ransomware attack or something like that, actually the tail cost is far more significant, because the cleanup costs, regulatory fines, and loss of customer confidence and revenue is a huge factor. So boards are now intimately aware of the risks of cyber to their organizations, and as such then are giving a mandate to their organization to protect revenue, protect customers. So the mindset is that defensive mindset, which is protect the business and protect shareholder value. And there's a very clear mandate coming from a lot of boards to do that, and therefore there's a matching resource commitment from the top and a budget to do that. I would suggest that probably in public sector and government, that mandate is less. There is more of a compliance mindset. You know, National Cybersecurity Centre is also a regulatory authority for the EU NIS directive. And there's a kind of a mindset, while the EU NIS is a good framework, and it is absolutely a step in the right direction, we need to come back to actually these are critical state services like health, like telecommunications, like power, etc., and that first and foremost we need to secure those services. And if we don't secure those services, A, citizens and state suffers, B, our prosperity suffers, because foreign direct investment will vote with their feet. That portable wealth and that portable capital that exists in Ireland will simply move. If we're below par in terms of cybersecurity, it will move. And so if the state adopts a mindset that says, actually, this is critical to societal progress and prosperity, and therefore that's what we're protecting, not some notional compliance to the EU around GDPR or EU NIS. Compliance is important, don't get me wrong, but if you approach it from a mindset of it is critical to our prosperity, it is critical to services, and it's critical to the economy and the citizens, then that's a different mindset. And therefore you're doing risk assessments, maturity capability assessments against that, and you're putting programs in place to secure that. And that's a mindset that perhaps isn't as obvious in the government and public sectors and it needs to be.
Thanks very much, Mr. Larkin. That's really what I suspected, and thank you for that clarity, Chairman. I think that helps us in our report from this particular piece of work in terms of trying to change that mindset. I don't think that it's necessarily a negative reflection on anybody within the state sector. It's just the culture that has existed, and I think Ms. Carlin certainly identified that in terms of trying to fit within certain pay scales. We have to look at the threat, and we have to look at modelling a solution that doesn't fit within the civil service box, if you want. So thanks very much for all your presentations. I'm going to have to drop off this now. Thank you.
I move to my own spot. First of all, thank you all for coming. This is a critical time in terms of cybersecurity, particularly in Ireland. Could I just ask a question to Mr. O'Reilly and then to Mr. Larkin? Why was the HSE in the Department of Health Systems attacked? Why did it happen? And is there any particular reason? How is Ireland perceived in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of the level of security we have? And is this a worldwide practice? So I might go to Mr. O'Reilly, just to put it in context. So why did these, are we talking about a lot of lone wolves out there? Are we talking this about being seriously organised? Why was the HSE system, the database, and the Department of Health system attacked in Ireland, and why now? So just maybe context, Mr. O'Reilly first, and then Mr. Halpin. Sorry, Mr. Larkin, rather.
Certainly, and thank you. And I'm located in Boston, although the member has just departed.
Can I just by way of, we want to compliment you on your reading. I see James Joyce and Samuel Beckett in the background. So you're probably up at an ungodly hour I had a quick look, you were probably up at 4 in the morning, so we thank you for this. But
it's a pleasure. Pleasure.
Thanks, Mr.
Yeah, the why of it, and thanks for having me, really, genuinely. The why of it is complex, but the simplest answer is that data is valuable, right? That's the simple answer. And the hospitals are getting hit over here as well. So if there's a sort of a reputational concern, the last time I was over in Ireland, it was about 2017, and I did meet with the Minister of Communications at the time, and he was telling me, that he wants Ireland to be primary cybersecurity center for all of the EU, and I can understand reputational concerns with respect to that, but everyone's getting hit. It's a global problem. These actors are inside states that often don't police their activities, so they're criminal organizations, but they punch a clock. They show up in the morning, and they work, and they're professionals, and they're criminals, and they're very disciplined at what they do, and they know what they're after, and what they're after is data. And health data is very, very valuable. Health data is valuable because if you steal it, the organizations are inclined to negotiate with you because it exposes private information, and it's valuable data. So there's even double ransomware strategies now. They're growing in capability, and there are many different reasons at the technical level of why as well. So there's software vulnerabilities, there's remote desktop protocol vulnerabilities, there's all manner of things that hackers can do. They can log on to a website called Showdown. They can look, for actual IP addresses. They can do any number of things to breach systems, and they will continue to. So we have a national ransomware task force over here at the moment. They came out with recommendations, and your firm's stance on non-payment is very impressive to me overseas. Because many of the companies here that are immediately compromised get into quick negotiations and often say publicly that they're not going to pay the ransom, but they've already paid it. Those are some of the whys.
Would that involve state organizations in America paying ransoms, Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, ransoms, it's just a recommendation the FBI came out with 60 industry leaders over here to not pay ransoms, but ransoms are frequently paid. With respect to state organizations, that's a little bit secret, that information over here. We don't really see it, but we see private organizations pay all the time.
And would you agree with the policy not to pay?
I would, long term, yes, absolutely, because when you pay, you effectively become the R&D department of these criminal organizations. And
Mr. Larkin, can you maybe why did they go after our HSE and Department of Health at this precise moment in time?
Correct, thanks for the question. I suppose I do need to declare that we are helping some of the agencies at the moment in the health service. So I suppose I need to be circumspect because we're in the middle of investigation. But I would think the general point of that the previous speaker has made, that healthcare is attractive because A, as the speakers pointed out, the data is valuable. B, in general, public or private, and our experience with both, is that it's an incredibly complex system. It's what they call a large attack surface area because of the complexity of the environment, because of the spread of the network, because of all the range of different users of the system. Doctors, nurses, students, plus vendors in there as well. So it's an incredibly complex environment, which means that it is relatively easy to target from an attack perspective. And even very robust health systems, because of that complexity, are also vulnerable as well. And then because obviously the ability to monetize the situation. So even where we don't pay ransom, and I agree with the previous speaker, I think it's a very principled and right decision not to pay the ransom. But the reality is over 56% of organizations pay ransom, usually because they have no choice, or also because they don't have the resources that perhaps the state does to now go through a very complex and lengthy and costly rebuild. And most organizations are faced with, particularly private organizations, are faced with a simple balance sheet choice, if you like, which is, do we spend tens of millions rebuilding, or do we spend $1 million getting the keys to unlock the system and get back to business, core business? So I don't think it's particularly, I suppose it doesn't help to speculate, but I don't know that there's any particular that they've consciously targeted Ireland or they've consciously targeted the Irish health system. I think it's another health system that is vulnerable. They've done a targeted attack on it that has been successful from their perspective. Very difficult for us as obviously a state. And I think the challenge is that today it could be the health system, tomorrow it could be the power grid, the day after it could be the transportation grid. And what you're seeing, and something to take cognizance of from a national security mindset, traditionally when you think national security, you're thinking state actors, delivering targeted attacks from a foreign policy perspective to influence a government. But what you're also seeing in this case is criminals, from a financial crime perspective, having similar attack profile and national damage as potentially state actors could have as well. So you've got to take a mindset here that criminal cartels can in some respects have the same consequential damage to a state as nation-state actors doing deliberate foreign policy-based attacks as well. So from a mindset perspective, you've got to look and say, defensively, you've got to secure against the criminals almost as much as you've got to secure against nation-state attacks, because either is of similar consequence and catastrophe to the state.
And Mr. Larkin, in terms you made in your opening statement, we need politically and socially to move to a national defence mindset with our national cybersecurity as one of the key pillars of our defence. So what do we need to do differently? And you spoke really about that as far as you're concerned. Like, we've had a terrible virus quietly hitting worldwide with the COVID-19 virus. we now have this, I suppose it's another form of a virus. So what do we need to do differently in Ireland? And secondly, where do you see the cybercrime going over the next 3 to 4 years?
I think what we need to do differently is we've got a wake-up call. You know, like the original point about cyber, environmental and global pandemic being on the risk registers, all of us, myself included, you know, silently hoped these would never occur. And therefore you're adopting the mindset of, yes, it's a risk, but, you know, do we need to do anything about it? They now have occurred and are occurring, you know, as we speak. So I think it's just recognizing that reality and moving to a mindset. I think that the national mindset in psyche is based off, you know, we're a neutral country, we're non-aligned, you know, we don't have aggressive foreign policy, so therefore we don't need a large defence organisation, we don't need a large national security infrastructure or apparatus. We actually do now from a cyber perspective. We need to adopt that mindset. It is not about projecting foreign policy or you know, insidious foreign policy. It is about protecting the societal benefits that we have and the economic benefits that we have. So we have to invest. We've underinvested historically in national security, and the threat is no longer a geographical threat because, you know, any of these organisations, whether they're nation state, whether they're criminal, can simply project themselves across the internet at Ireland. So if, as we're members of, for example, the UN Security Council, if we state a policy about, you know, the Israel-Palestinian conflict or whatever we rightly state our policy on, then perhaps not even a nation state, but a militia group within a nation state can object to that and inflict, you know, collateral damage on national security just by simply objecting to that. So it's to recognise that reality. It's to make the I suppose the philosophical mindset shift first, that we need to protect our national state and our resources and our sovereignty, and then it's to invest accordingly. That's, I think, the biggest thing is a societal mind shift and a political mind shift to say that national security is important. We have something worth protecting, and national security is important. And from there flows everything. From there flows, you know, we have a national risk assessment. It's updated regularly. We need to look at that because the risks were stated on that national risk assessment. And then we need, you know, to commit to government. And it is a whole of society commitment collaboratively that says, you know, government needs to do its bit, industry needs to do its bit, you know, citizenry needs to do its bit. And then, you know, once you adopt that kind of mindset, you sort of say, well, okay, we're about trying to secure ourselves nationally, but then you need collaboration and you need alliances. You can't do this if somebody's projecting themselves from a nation state, Eastern Europe, you know, Asia, wherever it is. We're not going to solve that problem from Ireland. We're going to have to solve that problem through alliances with international governments, with United Nations, with international law enforcement, policing and intelligence. So we need to try and build a consensus. We have an awful street credibility now, which is we're suffering a catastrophic attack on a national health system. If you look at countries like Estonia, who suffered a similar catastrophic attack against a wider set of their critical services in 2007, they came back from it stronger. They took this as a wake-up call, and now they're one of the leading organisations for, you know, projecting international law with respect to cyber. They've built alliances, albeit typically with NATO, around protection, and they've built a very clear strategy around delivering digital government from a point where they're being attacked either by nation state or by criminals from a very resilient perspective. So I think we take the wake-up call. We now make the mind shift to say we have to secure and we have to do it right. And we adopt a very coherent, well-resourced strategy to do that, and we stick at it. We don't just let this pass, and once the health system is recovered, you know, just move on, business as usual.
One final point.
We take the wake-up call.
We have an annual budget of $5 million going into the National Cyber Security Centre at this moment in time. Is that sufficient, Mr. Larkin?
I did a projection on a per capita basis just against the UK, who've spent about 2.9 billion on their national security from 2018 to 2023. So at a simple per capita basis, that would suggest we would need to be spending about 50 million plus, just as an order of magnitude. And this is the UK's second and third time doing this.
That's 10 times what we're spending at the moment.
Yeah, and the solution doesn't just reside with the National Cybersecurity. They're a point of focus and lead, obviously, okay. But it is way beyond. You know, it's the collaboration of society and organisations to fix
Mr.
it.
Larkin.
But as an order of magnitude, it's at least 10 times.
And just one quick question from Ms. Carolan. Ms. Carolan, You put in order that the salary for the director for the National Cybersecurity Centre, that vacant post, should be in the order of 220 to 290 with benefits. The post is being speculated in the media as around €89,000. Can you explain to me why you're going 220 to 290 is a very high salary? Why does it need to be at that level? And the type of person you're looking to get?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. An excellent question. So, look, I think, all of the speakers here today have set out how complex the situation is, and I suppose the challenge that we have before us, or if I can put it to, the opportunity that we have now to address and to resource upwards with an expert in cybersecurity space. The figures that I have quoted are kind on my expertise of 15 years hiring and recruiting in the technical space. I've built very strong partnerships with Ireland's top headhunters and, top business consultants whom every year and regularly run benchmarking, salary benchmarking data and benefit data right across Ireland and on an international level as needed. And it's keeping on top of what the market is telling us in terms of where we need to be at to draw the calibre of role or of candidate to the roles that we're looking for. And I'm recognising for this role, because there is going to be a huge span of responsibility, it's a very complex situation that will be, the person will be coming into and developing and really building something extremely solid, that the speakers have spoken about, where they see the vision of where this role needs to be at. This role really requires an expert, highly qualified, coming in with the gravitas that this role that is required to support the NCS Centre and really to drive, to bring with it the accountability that this needs. And it's really, this is a very high level role. There's a lot of responsibility, and it's comparing what is out there. What are other companies? Again, I will refer to, this is really looking at the private sector salary and benchmarking range, and that for us to get the top in-class candidate and calibre of expertise, knowledge, skill
Ms.
sets.
Caroline, I let other members follow up on that. Deputy Amorokwu, you have 7 minutes.
Look, I want to thank all the speakers. I'd agree with what's been said before. I think we have fairly conclusive proof to the narrative that's out there that we have insufficient capacity to deal with the situation that we're in. And the question I'd like to put to Mr. O'Reilly and possibly Mr. Larkin as well is in relation to, just putting it starkly, what exactly are we facing in relation to ransomware? I'm talking about the amount of attacks, the amount of criminals that we believe are operating in this situation. Mr. O'Reilly spoke obviously about the colonial oil situation, and obviously the big fear out there beyond even what has happened is the cyber to physical attack. And obviously us being wide open now, we all hope, as brutal and as heinous as the attack was on the HSC, and similarly, I suppose, the colonial oil attack, they were both high profile, and they may have, some of these gangs may have bit off more than they can chew. We all know that there is a certain narrative that some of them might even be, to put it, how do you put it, semi-state operators, so that there would be communications with states and these criminals, and maybe they've been told to rein themselves in. But the fact is, the threat is there and needs dealt with. So it's the threat we're facing and what exactly needs to be done. I'd also like Mr. Larkin, if you could give a bit more information in relation to the risk assessment. My fear is the NCSC, when it has a concentration on compliance, that it doesn't have the capacity to carry out that compliance, that risk assessment, and then that enforcement in relation to risk assessment that are carried out on organisations that are of critical importance to this state. Like, we need to, and it's what we need from a point of view of protecting the state, as Mr. Larkin said. And then I've even heard narrative in the last while that as we build that sort of capacity, we also need to build, you know, an element of offensive capacity.
First, Deputy Muraco.
If Mr. Larkin, if Mr. O'Reilly and Mr. Larkin could take the questions.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Sure. Yep. Thank you, Deputy. Yep. Those are very good questions, and understand the concerns. The ransomware has gone up by, you know, over 2020 is by about 311%. You know, and the ransoms, you know, that were paid out were up around 350 million. And that's, you know, that's just the disclosed stuff. So, you know, that they're going nowhere. Ransomware is continuing to be developed. And with concern, you know, to the semi-state actors, when I was on television, I was being asked repeatedly, you know, who's, you know, the states they're acting out of, who's responsible for this? You know, what's the, you know, and, you know, it's something that as a private citizen, I'm, you know, a little careful about. But I think we all know that, you know, they may be semi-state operators, right? And in that case, you know, that means there's more will behind it. And, you know, when it gets to cyber to physical, you want to be very careful how the political terms you speak in, obviously. Cyber to physical just keeps cyber professionals up at night. There was a lot of great research around it done in 2010, and, you know, so they were looking at attacks that to propagate over to generator systems and the like. And then 2015 happened, and we actually saw, you know, a grid go down in Ukraine. So those types of attacks are truly scary because they hit the national infrastructure. And in the States, we have a unique situation that 85% of our, you know, our public infrastructure is in private hands. This is a very difficult situation to be in, largely because it's hard to impel some of those holders of that infrastructure to do the right things. So, you know, we have some regulations in place to force that. But we're struggling at the moment, and we're scrambling. And the government has said all the right things after the colonial attack, and we're now evaluating whether actually pipeline security should be the Department of Transportation, and we have 6 individuals in oversight there. You know, so there's an analog to some of what you might be dealing with at the NCSC. Again, my company makes software. We benchmark organizations on cyber. We work across a large set of organizations. So my perspective is that, you know, you need standards, you know, and compliance is important, but it's just one aspect of the overall approach to cyber. And risk assessment, I love the term risk assessment because risk assessment is really the way forward. You know, you have to identify and prioritize, and risk assessments do that. They also take probabilities into account. And that's why information sharing is so important here in the States, because we have to have better and better ideas of what the probabilities are. And C-suites and boards will not invest if they can't financialize the actual risk. And in order to financialize risk, you've got to have good data. So, you know, these are important things to understand in the practice of cyber. Risk has to be understood. You know, compliance and risk are related. They're not unrelated. So, you know, I would just say that talking about it more is getting the private and public partnerships going that will help to solve this long term. So,
Deputy, if I just come in on your question then. So at an operational level in an Irish context, we have a security operations centre. 3 years ago, ransomware for our clients, either the clients we have or inbound clients, would have been typically about once a week, once a fortnight event. It's now a daily event. So we're dealing with ransomware incidents and outbreaks on a daily basis. So coming back to the previous speaker's point, it matches exactly with obviously the profile of increase. Why? Because it's so lucrative. It's so easy to execute, and it's so lucrative, and it's industrialized now from a cyber criminal's perspective. It's industrialized. There's a whole cyber criminal ecosystem. So when we talk about one group perpetrating this attack, actually it isn't one group. It is a whole layer of contractors and subcontractors that provide different ranges of services in perpetrating the attack, and then liberating and washing the finances associated with it. So there is absolutely the case that everybody, at an individual organization level and at a national level, we have to improve our cyber hygiene and just beat the odds. It's like your physical security in your home. If you put a burglar alarm in, if you put gates in and locks in, then typically the criminal passes by, because it's more difficult to break into your house than your neighbors. So unfortunately, you're trying to secure yourself so that you're at the smaller end of the probability scale. I agree with the previous speaker's point. It's all about risk. And mitigating risk, because you can spend an infinite amount of money, resources, and time delivering security and security technology, but actually the majority of it is inefficient if you're not deploying it against identified risk and mitigating that risk. And I think it comes back then to the broader agenda where we do need to lead as well, which is we've got to change the game here. We've got to target internationally. You've got to make this type of activity, you've got to make the organizations perpetrating it pariahs. You've got to make any nation states that are facilitating it or ambivalent towards it pariahs. And there've got to be sanctions. You've got to enforce it. And at the moment, at the UN, there's still debates about, is cyber law adequate, and how are we going to deploy it, and how are we going to enforce it. But because this is a global problem, whilst we can secure our critical services or organizations, etc., infinite defense in its own right is not a strategy. Infinite defense, the principle of defense from my military days is you defend and protect yourself long enough that you can launch a counterattack. That's the argument for defense. If you're not in a position to launch counterstrike against the people perpetrating this, then at some point they're going to get in. You can defend and defend and defend, but at some point they're going to get in. So we need a global consensus to say this activity is a higher order of crime, particularly when it attacks critical national infrastructure or health systems. So it's not a financial crime. This is a higher order of crime. Without being dramatic about it, there are adverse patient outcomes to what's happened in the health system, leading to increased mortality. So this is not a financial crime. This is a crime against society, and it's a crime against people. And you've got to look at it as that higher order of crime. And we've got to try and mobilize the United Nations and people like that to say, this is unacceptable. The people perpetrating this are pariahs, and we've got to go after them and their assets and their infrastructure like they were narco-terrorists or like they're international criminals. And we've got to go after states that are ambivalent or facilitating or perpetrating this as international pariahs.
Yeah, no, look, I really appreciate that. I think you got the point around pariahs. So what we're talking about is a legal and international and technological capacity, and the ability within even the state, while dealing with other people, to counterstrike. Could I just ask a really quick question in relation to the FBI ransomware task force? Because obviously we are going to build a greater level of, we need a greater level of capacity, I believe, than what just exists within the NCSC. And we need to look at, obviously the likes of this. And then if it was possible to ask Mr. Walsh in relation to what we need to do from a point of view of ensuring we have throughput of the skill sets that are required to do battle in this arena. So if Mr. O'Reilly could
Mr. O'Reilly first, and then Mr. Walsh.
To the FBI.
Yeah, effectively the FBI, in cooperation with 60 industry leaders, came out with a set of recommendations around ransomware recently, and the main one was, don't pay the ransom. This is a long-term strategy with respect to, sort of starving those criminal organizations. And I'm full agreement with the previous speaker that they need to be made pariahs. And, their infrastructure was targeted in the colonial attack over here as well, I believe. And while our government wasn't specific about it, they didn't deny it. And they retweeted some of those stories with respect to the servers being taken down. And there was a bit of a scramble then from the criminal organization with respect to what they'd done and what, the actual consequences. The ransomware task force, I would just make one additional point. They're coming out with a framework to deal with ransomware. And the framework is going to be modeled upon the cybersecurity framework. I'm a big believer in gold standards and best practices, and I heartily support such task force. The public-private partnerships are how progress has been made in cyber as of late. So, thank you.
Walsh, finally.
Yeah. All right.
Mr. Walsh?
Yes.
You just did a question there from Deputy Murco on the skill sets in terms of throughput of graduates and so forth.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Deputy Murco. Yeah, the challenge, I suppose, is that we see an explosive growth in this sector, and Ireland is positioning itself as kind of a world leader in a sense, with all the top companies, particularly multinationals, based here. And right now, we're augmenting, our hiring needs by bringing people in from outside of Ireland to fill some roles, and that's working. But we also need to focus on the pipeline, and that really starts actually at primary school level and secondary school level by creating awareness around security, and that has a twofold benefit. One is it helps maybe attract people into the industry, but also it makes students more aware of protecting themselves and security risks online, and that in turn can benefit society in general. So creating more interest in schools, and then calling out the opportunities that exist in cybersecurity, because it is a very broad sector. There are many different aspects to it, and it's a tremendous opportunity for young people to have very fulfilling careers in a kind of rewarding and challenging areas. So creating more graduates who have cybersecurity expertise, more master's programs, and then more research and development. There are some top class research teams in the country right now, both in industry and in academia, and trying to connect these organizations together to focus on research projects, that create more security for, companies, the organizations, and obviously the state as well. So, I think it's not going to change quickly, but we really have to put a very focused effort on making it more attractive. I think computer science as a subject in Leaving Cert is critical, and creating modules around cybersecurity in all of the development courses, software development courses in universities today help. But I think there needs to be more focus on creating more opportunity, more programs as well, in addition to what we have today.
I'll now move to Senator Harkin. Senator Harkin, you have 7 minutes.
Chair, just beforehand, I'm not asking a question. I just want to state that we should probably look out for that ransomware task force framework, and also when the NCSE review is actually carried out, we possibly should look at some of these speakers and possibly maybe a couple of others involved in university research as regards cybersecurity and training as well.
Yeah,
all right.
We'll be following up very much on both of those in terms of particularly the capacity review is underway, and obviously I think the public-private element. But we look at this as a body of work, so we'll obviously be coming back on this particular issue, and really the witnesses have been great. Senator Harkin, you have 7 minutes.
Thanks very much, Cathaoirleach, and thanks very much all the witnesses for being here. It's obviously, it is, we kind of consider this to be a relatively new area, but realistically, I'm of an age that I remember movies like War Games and Die Hard, where systems were being taken down in terms of air traffic control systems, and nuclear missiles were going to be launched by 10 and 12-year-olds. So this is not that new in terms of a topic, even though it's now on our doorstep, and such a scenario that we're not able now to find out the number of COVID cases per day, the level of vaccination updates. We're not able to email the HSE or the Department of Health in the way that we'd be normally. And technology, as we can see from being on this meeting, it's everything to us now. Are there examples? I'm aware that Estonia became a very digital society when it became a separate state in the early 90s, and I don't know if it's an example of best practice in terms of cybercrime. But are there any examples? We're never probably going to hear of the companies that do badly, but are there companies or countries that we can learn from to say, this is the way we should be going? I think the conversation today has been useful in terms of raising the expectations and I suppose outlining the expectations of somebody who is going to have these roles. The idea, the market is the market, but the idea that somebody's going to be paid more than the Taoiseach as this role is, as I suppose, probably going to be something that Irish society in general will find a little bit difficult to process initially, but equally the cost of tens of millions in terms of lost revenue, in terms of hijacking, in terms of having to rebuild systems is much, much greater than that. But one individual isn't going to change this. Is there a roadmap? What we can hire somebody and we can spend 3 or 4 or 6 months getting the best person in the world and paying them $250,000 a year or whatever it is. But really, what's the roadmap in terms of us? This changes all the time. These guys only have to be lucky once. But I suppose I'm looking. We've brought all of you experts here today, and I thank you all for your statements. But where, as a country, do we need to go from here? It's obviously we need more people. We need training. 6,000 people. I was surprised there are that many involved in dealing with cybercrime on a daily basis in Ireland. But really, I'm looking to you as experts in this area. What do we need to do as a country in the next month, in the next 6 months, in the next 5 years? We can spend more, we can recruit more, but really, what's the roadmap? Thank you.
Larkin and then with Mr. O'Reilly.
Thank you, Senator. I think in terms of your initial question, I think there are 2 countries that are probably 3 countries that are probably notable. Estonia, as you pointed out, because they had a compelling event and they responded appropriately in terms of what you've outlined, and have become a recognised centre of excellence. And that kind of strategy of saying that they've got to survive, particularly malevolent state action, and they've got to maintain society and even delivery of digital government in the event of a significant attack or influence. So definitely they're a base model. UK, in terms of appointing, they've probably come back to their national cybersecurity strategy 2-3 times, but I think this time round they've certainly made huge progress. The cyber czar they've put in is a very recognisable individual who's added an awful lot of coherence, Mr. Kieran Martin, and he's definitely added a huge amount of coherence in terms of overall policy. And they've engaged in things like active cyber defence, where not only are they sitting in defence, but they're actually targeting bringing down, malicious domains, malicious sites within their organisation, improving the cyber hygiene of government across the board, offering services that various public bodies would use, etc., and getting a significant level of investment. So I think there's lessons to be learned from how the UK have approached this second or third time round. A society that I would call out, I appreciate there may be reservations in terms of other aspects of the society, but a society that has certainly done well from a cyber perspective that we should look at is Israel. So Israel, because obviously they have the foreign policy and national security imperative, have delivered a very collaborative approach between military society. Now, it is a very militarized society, I accept, and therefore there is an acceptance that cyber is a very important pillar. But from a government perspective, they've led initiatives like thinking outside the cyber box, etc. So they've led to huge levels of innovation. And I was part of a buying mission when I was in the Defence Forces back in the late 90s. And I saw that level of collaboration between industry, users and military, where literally, some industry players had co-resident development ongoing with the military, and the military were consuming their development of technology, and then they were using that to export, obviously, to international countries. So I think in terms of a security imperative and a collaborative national approach, Israel is an example, appreciating all the other reservations about, policy, etc., going on there. But I think there are 3 examples that you could look to build a collaboration, to, create the cyber czar and the leadership, and, from a national imperative to, I suppose, digital society to survive malign foreign intervention.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the roadmap, you're talking about the best countries we can learn from, and I don't mind whether this is Paul or Pádraig or Pat. As a country, we recruit a chief cybercrime guru, czar, whatever we want to call him. He gets a budget of even 10 times the 5 million we have, maybe the 50 million. Where do we go from there? Pádraig, maybe is it from an American perspective or?
Sure, certainly. Yeah, well, the Colonial Pipeline attack expedited some things that were already underway in our government. I would second all the things the previous speaker said with respect to best practices. We still have challenges in the States. We spend quite a bit more. We spend something like 20 billion on cyber per year. We have a lot of very good standards and organizations that generate such standards. The National Institutes of Standards and Technology does a fine job. And the federal government does baseline themselves regularly. That said, there are many challenges that remain. So, with respect to best practices, you can certainly look at the executive order that was just released from the White House. It's pretty comprehensive. The emphasis is really on information sharing to some extent and on changing the acquisition contracts around companies that do business with the federal government. And that emphasis is really around information sharing as well. One of the big problems in cyber in the States is, visibility into true risk. We don't have, frequently there's just these informational problems. Companies are not reporting what's happening to them. There's an incentive not to, right? But fresh air is the best disinfectant. And, when I was asked recently about this issue, I basically said it's hard to do risk assessment if you don't have complete data sets, And, I hope to see out of our government more emphasis on actually generating quality data sets with respect to risk, because that'll help governance structures make the improvements they need to make. And so I would just reemphasize that, the executive order is a real fount of late for best practice. I revisit it every day. Newspapers call me every day to talk about it. The first recommendation they had is an interesting one. It's to make sure that logging practices are being done properly. And there's really a set of maybe 10 things that can be done across the board that are not prohibitively expensive, that can be measured, and you can put metrics around and get the critical infrastructure or your essential services sector on the right path. So thank you.
Right. I need to move now to, I've about 5 contributors, so I'm time. Deputy Joe Carey, you have 7 minutes, Deputy Carey.
Thanks very much, Chairman. And I want to thank all the witnesses. I think it's a very valuable meeting we're having today, and I want to thank you, Chairman, for organising it. Just in terms of our own state's response to this whole cyber attack and our cyber ecosystem in this country, what type of investment is required in terms of personnel, in terms of infrastructure? What should it look like in Ireland? I note there that Mr. Larkin has said that in the UK they're spending 10 times more per head of population on a similar system there. So what should it look like? What type of frame should it take? And I note that Mr. O'Reilly is saying that big wins have been made when there is collaboration between public and private. And we can see in this attack that that's, basically what's happening behind the scenes is that, you have a collaboration between public and private to try and come to terms with a response to dealing with this. And ultimately, there needs to be a very strong global response to cyber security, because basically, when you have all different countries doing their own little thing, and these criminals are preying on countries and their weaknesses, and we have been exposed in this, and it's desperate to see the fallout. These criminals preying on vulnerable, sick people in our health system, and to see the impact that is having on the ground. It is truly shocking.
We will let Mr. Larkin take your question, conscious of
time. Sure. I just want to know what should the state's national cyber security ecosystem look like in terms of what investment is required in personnel, in resources?
Mr.
Riley. Thank you, Senator. I think very quickly, I think if you compare the analogy, I think first and foremost, a very clear commitment from government to say that national security, cybersecurity is important, and therefore we have got to move to, nationally we've got to move to from immature to optimized. I think a very clear statement around that. You've got a national risk register, I think, conducted by the Department of Defence. So taking the risk-based approach is looking at the risk register and then building, strategic and tactical and operational mitigation of that risk with commitment to it. Because, once we're talking about budget and spend, it's wasted unless you map it and use it in terms of strategically planned risk mitigation approaches. So I think commitment from the executive, if you like, to say that national cybersecurity is important and that we're really going to focus on improving it. That feeds down to then it's coordinated at a central level. What you don't want is turf wars and silos within government, and so somewhere maybe under NSAC or somewhere under the Taoiseach, I think it needs to be coordinated from a national security perspective, and the cybersecurity pillar underneath that to drive it. You use resources like the National Cybersecurity Centre then to provide leadership and governance, particularly of critical national infrastructure services, and you use the standards and frameworks that are there, EU NIS, ISO, NIST, etc. And then you've already started the genesis of the collaboration piece. Cyber Ireland, of which I should declare I'm also a board member with Paul and Owen, I think is perhaps the genesis of this, because that has an economic agenda, which is about creating the ecosystem of industry, academia, research and government. So it is further support of that. IDA and Enterprise Ireland are already supporting that. And that will in some respects create the talent pool, the industry imperatives, etc. But I suppose out of your national security plan, you've got to say all of that is key, but then you've got to build indigenous capability. And it's then bringing all the resources of the state and their tasking up to date. That you're mandating police to obviously police cybercrime and state security. You're mandating defence to build capability. In some respects, I would know just colloquially that in some respects defence they have their challenges obviously, but they've been constrained and contained in terms of the cyber role. And they have there's an opportunity there for every soldier to be a cyber soldier, for argument's sake, from an innovation perspective, because of a training mandate. And then they would bring huge national resource in aid to the civil power, to all the rest of the authorities on a crisis basis. So it's about innovation. It's taking the imperative from the top down to say, this is really important, we need to solve it, we need to improve it, and then all the strategy and resource flowing from there.
Byrne wants to come in on that as well. Dr. Byrne.
Thank you, Chair. Just to respond to Deputy Carey's question and build on Mr. Larkin's previous point, there's an opportunity here to build on public-private partnership, and we've started that already with Cyber Ireland, the National Cybersecurity Cluster Organisation, which is aiming to bring industry, academia and government together to address specific challenges for industry, but also for national security as well. Where it developed out of was addressing the talent and skills shortage, and a lot of the challenges have been clearly identified there already. So I won't go through them again, but it's also important to say that there's a huge amount of work already being done in growing homegrown cybersecurity talent in Ireland. We have programmes there supported by government, which is training up 5,000 professionals in cybersecurity skills all across different areas of the economy. There was 14 new courses funded by government last year in cybersecurity in our higher education sector. There's a cybersecurity apprenticeship programme that's producing entry-level graduates into the sector. And just last year, there was an €8 million funded project under the Higher Education Authority Human Capital Initiative, which is aiming to produce hundreds of new cybersecurity graduates. That's been led out of Munster Technological University and 4 other academic institutes. We have other groups such as Cyber Women Ireland, which are addressing gender diversity, and also then looking at career promotion for secondary school students, such as the Cybersecurity Academy that we're involved in, and summer camps for internships as well. So there's a lot being done there, but there's a lot more that we can do. And looking at international examples like the UK, for example, their Cyber First programme for secondary school students, and also the US, where they have cyber ranges, so virtual training facilities to provide cybersecurity training, education to secondary school students, third level students and citizens as well. Another key point, I suppose, that was the reason to develop Cyber Ireland was the low level of collaborative research and development that's currently in Ireland between industry and academia.
Okay.
And this is a severe challenge because there's currently a fragmented approach to cybersecurity research in Ireland, where academic and research entities are trying to address these urgent national scale cybersecurity challenges through a kind of a disconnected or small scale response. And I suppose we really need to look at developing a national cybersecurity research centre to address this challenge. I suppose the potential there is to develop cybersecurity research solutions that could have sectoral applications where Ireland is already a leader, so in manufacturing, processing, biopharmaceutical sectors, Industry 4.0 and so on.
Dr. Byrne,
and then also, I suppose, the information.
Dr. Byrne, just for, might I suggest, we're very caught in time. If you could give us submission, that National Cybersecurity Centre would be something we'd be very interested in. If you could give us maybe a submission on that as a committee. But I have about 3 or 4 members, and with COVID restrictions, we have to be out here at a certain time. So I apologise, but can you give us a further, we'll come back to it at a later time. Is that okay?
I'd be happy to do so, Chair. Thank you.
I'll now move to Deputy Michael Lowry. Deputy Lowry, you have 7 minutes.
Chair, in view of the time, I won't take 7 minutes. I want to thank our participants for sharing their expertise and their insight. And I think everything that we've heard this morning indicates and highlights the magnitude and the complexity of the problem. And when it comes to cybersecurity, it's quite obvious at this stage that Ireland left the front door and the back door open. And we're now reacting to fix the damage. The damage is done, and I've no doubt that our complacency is going to cost us dearly. I hear Mr. Byrne highlighting there what has been done in the past couple of years. What begs the question here is the HSE are the biggest organisation in the country. They're handling billions of taxpayers' money. Why were they so complacent? Why were they so outdated? Why were their defences so weak? And I would say that the reason they were attacked is that it was obvious that they were vulnerable and ready for an attack and open for an attack. And so from a technical perspective, what I would ask is, why was the department, or why is the Department of Health and the HSE so vulnerable? And could I ask a question in relation to, in summary, what's involved in putting in place a defence mechanism? We've heard that we should be spending in the region of 50 million, but if you have the budget and if you have the personnel and you have to put the infrastructure in place, what is the timescale involved in actually bringing it up to a standard that is acceptable? And could I also just then ask Mr. Riley, and data is valuable, data is very personal to every individual, and when it comes to this, you see the opportunity here for double ransom from the HSE or ransom from the service provider, whichever one it is. And the question comes up here then that you have the opportunity for double ransom from the individual, from the service provider. And what I'm wondering is, what has happened in the States in regard to GDPR and duty of care of the provider? Has that left not alone the state open to ransom and its agencies open to ransom, but has it left it also open to legal actions? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yep. With respect to GDPR, it hasn't taken quite the foothold in the States that we see in the EU. It's jurisdictionally not, something that a lot of American companies and concerns deal with, certainly not localized health concerns. And we have a very distributed healthcare delivery system, so it's quite different than your institution at the moment. We do have those states who have been frustrated perhaps by federal inaction with respect to privacy regulations. that have put their own standards into place. So CCPA, the California Privacy Act, and other states have followed suit. So that as a means of enforcement and fine delivering bodies has taken a bit of a hold here in the States. But I don't know that I've seen the impact necessarily across the healthcare delivery system in the States as of yet. We really, in the States, have a very, very distributed, privatized system. So when I wound up talking about cyber after the Colonial Pipeline attack, it's sort of a case study, a unique case study of how having public infrastructure in private hands goes quarter to quarter in terms of investment. And a longer-term CapEx is required with respect to mandating standards and the like, and tying the actual performance around measuring risk and standards to actual numbers and analytics so that organizations can make decisions about how they go about remediating. If there's no way to measure it, if you're just sort of doing one-off risk assessments yearly and the data is a year old, when you revisit it and do the analytics, it's old data and it's not effectively, in some respects it's useless. So our private sector in cyber, I would just sort of make this point, has done brilliant things. We have, like Israel, say, for example, many tech startups that do incredible things, can do endpoint detection. I have a partner company, some of our investment group, has invested in Versec, which does ring zero malware detection, looks at memory protocols, effectively killing something, like 100% of attacks. So there's brilliant solutions in the private space. It's just that there's not enough cooperation to date, public and private. And, the company was founded around the cybersecurity framework, which was a consortium of 3,000 industry experts in cooperation with NIST. So, it's initiatives like that that drive more and more cooperation between the private and the public sector. And the public sector is great at certain things, private sector is great at certain things, and you need that cooperation to actually get the synergies and efficiencies going forward.
And the time scale, Mr. Larkin, or any of our guests there, how long does it take to rebuild this system and to put up our defences?
I think, on average, to rebuild from a ransomware attack is weeks and months in totality. I mean, you'll get critical systems back up quite quickly, but our experience is that, for maybe 6-9 months, you're still dealing with the fallout of a significant attack, whether it's ransomware or others. So just to probably set expectations around that. The tail cost is ongoing, obviously associated with that. And what's really important here is to take the lessons learned. So any part of a systemic review, what we should be focusing on is the lessons learned out of this, and then building that in as improved controls and governance and structures to try and prevent this and to share. There's lessons here that will be across healthcare, but there's lessons here that will be across the whole country, globally as well. So to share intelligence. I've kind of been a long advocate that we take an aviation approach to cybersecurity, which is we disclose, we investigate, we systemically take the learnings and re-engineer them back into the particular impacted systems, and you standardize. That would be the approach. In terms of building a strategy and defenses, I think you got to look at this as collectively, not specifically HSE or anybody else. I think collectively we are moving from immature to try and get to optimized, and that's a program of work that's probably 5-10 years. So I think that's a strategy we need to adopt as well.
Mr. Deputy Lowry?
No, I'm happy with that. That's the time scale, 5 to 10 years if you have everything in place.
Thanks, Deputy Lowry. We'll now move to Senator Jerry Crockwell. Senator Crockwell, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Based on what has been said today, I'd be interested in Mr. Larkin, Dr. Byrne and Mr. Walsh's comment on the following. Ireland's significant lack of a security culture and awareness, it may well be based on an insular, naive belief in goodness and the lack of interest in security and defence issues. The lack of interest leads on to an ostrich-type smugness, which has led us to the dangerous situation that we find ourselves in Ireland today. Security and defence are one and the same thing. The Defence Forces, I know that Larkin was a member of the Defence Forces. they provide 40-odd security outputs for the state that most politicians and civilians are totally unaware of. The running down of the defence forces, and particularly the 2 absent seats at the National Cybersecurity Centre, is that something that we need to address fairly quickly? In the case of Ms. Carlin, thank you very much for your submission this morning. You have sent shockwaves through the entire committee with salaries ranging from 220 to 290 and bonus payments with benefits. However, if we take it the head of the person that we're talking about,
Senator Crockwell, you need to repeat from where you spoke about Ms. Carolyn. Your sound dropped off.
Sorry. Am I back online now? Yeah.
You are. Yeah.
Okay. Ms. Carlin, the head of the HSE has paid 420,000, so the 290 you're suggesting is not extraordinary by any means. But it's your view we have to compete in the public sector, or sorry, the private sector, for the people we're looking for. We don't pay bonuses in the public sector, so does that mean the base salary will have to go even higher than what you're suggesting? In the case of Cyber Ireland, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Walsh and Dr. Byrne. Really, the development of cyber at junior cert level, it has always been a regret of mine that Rory Quinn's programme was not embraced when he brought it forward to develop education. Even though I was the president of the union that stopped it, I do believe that we need to develop this. I'm really interested in what you have to say, Dr. Byrne, about the apprenticeships, but I think we're going to find ourselves tight on time. Some countries in Europe, particularly some of the Nordic countries, moved to open source software in the late 1990s, early noughties, as far as I'm aware. If we had open source software that was bespoke for the purposes within each department, would it be a safer type of platform rather than purchasing what's commercially available? And finally, just a couple of quick points. I assume the National Cybersecurity Centre would be probing organisations throughout the country all the time. Mr. O'Reilly might want to come in on this, and Mr. Larkin. Should there be sanctions against a company that fails, particularly if you have semi-state or state organisations that fail? The stories coming out of the HSE about computer monitors with passwords taped to the monitor so as people can have quick access and things like that. I mean, surely there must be, it's not just about sitting in an office on cybersecurity, it's a proactive move throughout an organisation, I would think. You mentioned the FDI risks. I think it was you, Pat, that mentioned FDI risks. Would you care to quantify what type of the type of risk we're exposing ourselves to? We have so many organisations here. And finally, with respect to a cybersecurity centre, which department should it be under? Should it be in defence? Should it be in justice? Or is it fine where it is in transport and communications? Chairman, thank you very much.
We might do it in the following order. We might start with Mr. Larkin, then we'll move to Ms. Carolyn, and then between Mr. Walsh and Dr. Ryan. So, Mr. Larkin.
Thank you, Chairman. In terms of the FDI risk, I think there's an unquestionable, something we need to be aware of. As organisations look to locate in a country, they assess the security of the good business environment, the access to talent and resource pools, and then the security of their investment. That's kind of the criteria that they use. We brief boards regularly. On foot of this event, I've had a number of requests for briefing, one large natural resources company, etc. And the nature of the briefing is such that they're looking to assess, was this a nation-state attack in our opinion? Was it, what is the state of national cyber defence, etc. So I think there's a heightened awareness. I don't know that there's any imminent risk per se, immediate risk, but I think you got to look at it as a long game here. The long game is that we've got to build, strong, mature, optimized cybersecurity capability to protect all the resources in the state. And if we do that, then we'll continue to attract FDI and retain it. And that's why Cyber Ireland is so intrinsically important to this whole strategy as well. In terms of the location of the NCSC, in some respects, I think it's as appropriate where it resides as anywhere else, provided that the national security governance and commitment is joined up, and that needs to come from centre of government, somebody that can drive that strategy into all parts of government and organisation. In terms of sanction, I think the challenge is blaming the victim is perhaps unhelpful here, because we don't blame people, homeowners, when their house is burgled. We do point to them where they could improve their security, etc. But blaming the victim in some respect creates a perverse incentive for the ransomware attackers, because if we're going to blame the victim, then there's an increased incentive not to disclose and pay. So I think we've got to move to a mindset of supporting and getting the victim to improve their security. And I think I think there won't be a healthcare professional working in the health system that will not be traumatized by what has happened, and both COVID and ransomware. And I think you will get goodwill. So a compelling event like what has happened, as disastrous as it is quite often, if used positively, a really good spur to drive improvement and to gain buy-in to improvement. If it's a stick-only approach, I think you'll achieve very little progress.
To Ms. Carolyn quickly, and then to Mr. Walsh and Dr. Ryan.
Super. Thank you, Senator Crockwell. An excellent question indeed. So just by quick response, look, this is an exceptional role, and I've no doubt that time to time in the public sector, as we do in private, indeed, there are exceptions, and there's in my language there's an exception to every rule, and we really need to make it attractive to attract and retain the right person to this role. Maybe we might look to the NTMA, who applied private sector packaging towards towards hiring particular key talent for the NTMA, albeit within the public sector, and possibly apply a model akin to that.
Okay. And then Mr. Walsh and Dr. Byrne, briefly.
Thank you, Chair. So on the Senator's question on a security awareness programme at a national level, I think that's an incredibly important point. It's being used throughout Europe and internationally to raise awareness of cybersecurity. And I think it's important that we tell a story of the impact of cybersecurity on society and start a national conversation around cybersecurity now as well. And that needs to be funded appropriately. And the NCSC does have a national cybersecurity awareness programme that it runs in October, in line with the European Cybersecurity Month as well, which is run by the European Agency for Cybersecurity, ENISA. And then there's also a role for Ireland to play within Europe for cybersecurity. Just this morning, there's a European Commission workshop on the establishment of the European Cybersecurity Competency Centre, which is looking at supporting indigenous European SMEs to develop, to innovate, to grow and compete internationally, while also building Europe's cybersecurity posture and strategies as well. There will be national cybersecurity coordination centres set up as part of this European Competency Centre. So Ireland will be setting up one of these, and that needs to be set up within 6 months of the European Competency Centre, which is being set up in Bucharest in the coming months. So there's a decision there. Does Ireland want to lead the way in setting up its national coordination centre, or does it want to wait and see what other organisations and member states are doing? And in relation to the Junior Cert programme, there's already actually work being done by the National Cybersecurity Centre in developing a junior cycle programme in cybersecurity. I think they're piloting that next September for transition year students, but definitely as part of the Leaving Cert curriculum, it would be important that the computer science module there would have a cybersecurity element to it as well. And then for the apprenticeship programme, I suppose this is providing entry-level graduates into the sector. There's a number of conversion courses as well there that is taking people that have become unemployed from COVID.
Dr. We have to be out of here by just after 25 to us. I have one more contributor, so apologies for curtailing your contribution, but we'll follow on. Deputy Cathal Crowe, Deputy Crowe, I'm going to give you 7 minutes. Once the 7 minutes are up, so I'm going slightly over the time, but I think it's only appropriate. So, Deputy Crowe.
Thanks, Chairman. I just want to thank our witnesses. I've been following. I've had IT problems myself today. Don't worry, they're not virus or malware related.
Any ransom demanded, Deputy Crowe?
No, not yet. Anyway, not yet. Look, one of the big take-home points I took, I was quite alarmed to hear that the cybercrime has now overtaken the illicit drugs trade.
And Deputy Crowe, can you adjust your camera? Your head is above the camera. Come down another bit. You're okay. Yeah. You're now on camera. Yeah.
Apologies. One of the take-home points I took from the presentation this morning was that there is now cybercrime has now overtaken the illicit drugs trade worldwide. And I thought that was very alarming. It just puts context to everything's at. So this is a form of attack. Our country has been under attack for the last week and a half or so. It's a form of new warfare, if you like. It's where a country is laid siege on by another entity. I just want to ask a question. It hasn't come up so far, but it concerns me that it's going to take us 5 to 10 years to get a full capacity as a nation to fight back against cyber attacks. And in that time, things will have shifted hugely as well. So we may get to a finish point and yet find that the whole world has changed in that interim period as well. The other thing that struck me was this form of attack. As I said, it is a form of warfare. We are a neutral country militarily. But when it comes to cyber attacks, this is a global problem. Do we really need, I want to put this question maybe to some of our panel here today, do we really need to be going so far to create our own competency to fight cybercrime, knowing that other countries spend far more than us, knowing that their systems are far more advanced than ours? Is this something where we should cede some of our cyber neutrality and actually ask another nation, another country or entity which has a far greater capacity to fight this off, to ask them to support us in that regard? This happens very often in the military sense, where countries build alliances. Ireland is small. Our capacity is going to take 5 or 10 years to build. Our neighbours in Britain spend 10 times more than us per head of population fighting cybercrime. Is there a logic, and is there any precedent, could I ask Mr. Pat Larkin, in terms of other countries leaning on that to support their fight back in this regard?
I might let Mr. Larkin go first and then Mr. O'Reilly to conclude. Mr. Larkin.
So maybe if just one contributor, I'd like to come in with another question, if you don't mind, Chairman.
Just to Mr. Larkin, is it? Yeah. Mr. Larkin then.
Thank you, Deputy. I think there's a need for collaboration. There's a need for not reinventing the wheel, absolutely. I think you do need to have indigenous capability. You may use tools, resources, etc., from collaboration, alliances, allegiances, whatever you want to term them. So I think you're not going to fight this on your own, but you need indigenous capability first and foremost. I don't think you could depend, because alliances will change. So I think you need indigenous capability. But in order to be successful, you will have to partner and have alliances. And those alliances may not necessarily compromise our neutrality. I think that they're just collaboration that would happen between policing, between defence agencies, intelligence agencies, peer-to-peer, National Cybersecurity Centre, etc. And also collaboration with industry, with academia. In terms of staying current, your point about the investment we're making, it is a very agile approach. So something like the National Cyber Research Centre and the drawing together of the research and development strands, I think, is absolutely critical to leading and staying very current, and integrating that into the whole approach is very important.
Okay, thank you for that. I just think the way I understand it, this doesn't fall into the realm of Interpol. This doesn't form properly into the realm of military alliances. So whilst we may be militarily neutral, we're certainly not neutral in this regard. And I would say in that 5 to 10 year period, as we try to build up an indigenous capacity, we should be leaning on all support. And I don't care where we go to in that regard. Once there are nations that have a capacity to help support us and have a system superior to ours, we should lean on that as much as we can. My last question is, 14 months ago, before being elected to the Dáil, I was a primary school teacher. And in every primary school, there's a vertical axis in the principal's office, there's a computer that's networked all the way up to the department, and it would hold a lot of sensitive data. But then go out to all the classrooms. You could have a Windows 95, Windows 97 laptop, which is linked back into the principal's office. And this would be typical of every school in Ireland. And there's a real chink in the armour there. So, like, if you were to get into a teacher's laptop at any time, there would be everything from tests, assessment data, but there could also be information, very sensitive information. That's just education. Probably the same is replicated in the small 2 or 3 Garda station out in rural Ireland, or the local health centre run by the HSE. I think we probably have fairly robust systems in the central vertical axis of organisations, but far, far weaker when we go out. If I could finally ask just Mr. Larkin again, sorry about that, that those outposts of state organisations and government agencies, is that where the chink in the armour is really here?
I don't think so. I think the chink is, you got to take it, the chink is perhaps everywhere. You know, you're right, you do need an approach that does secure the citadel, you know, the really critical parts of your network, etc., and where the data resides. But I think realistically, the reality is, without being alarmist, the reality is on every part of infrastructure, power, utilities, etc., you will find, whether it is laptops, whether it is what they call OT devices that exist that perhaps are not appropriately controlled or secured. And so that relentless risk assessment, that relentless information security management is trying to identify those points on highly secure and highly critical networks as much as less secure peripheral networks, to find those vulnerability points and those weaknesses and to either secure them or remove them. And our experience would be that at the center of some of the most sensitive and eye-rollingly scary environments, you will find the same weaknesses that you've just outlined in terms of, you know, relatively insecure or uncontrolled devices creeping onto those networks and producing a very vulnerable point that by which those networks can be compromised.
And could I finally ask, where ransoms have been paid, did the attack stop? Where ransoms have been paid, did the attack stop? Or are there instances where another attack follows on a few weeks or months later again?
In our experience, where ransom is paid, you get the keys. The keys, as you will see from what's going on in the health service at the moment, is just the beginning of a journey of pain to recover data and systems, that it's not necessarily always instantaneous to recover those. But the ransomware business model in general depends on the ransomware providers doing what they say they do. It's a business model in inverted terms. So therefore, if they don't release the systems, then they don't get paid. So the model usually is that they do what they say they do, because if they don't, then they don't have a business model.
Okay, thanks, Chairman.
And in that context, Mr. Larkin, why did the ransomware, or the pariahs, as you, I think, more appropriately call them, why did they hand back keys to the HSE? Why did they hand that back?
I suppose, can I answer the question more generally rather than specifically to the HSE, because I'm obviously compromised in terms
maybe
of...
you can go from the maybe you might go from the general to the specific. By the time you get to the end of the answer, it might be a bit specific.
I think the general point, I would suspect, and I mean, it's speculation in general points, that these guys typically do it for either a business reason, and I suppose the reason that you could speculate more generally as to why they would do this is perhaps political pressure. You know, if they're operating from environments that there is ambivalence towards them, then perhaps they've broken a norm here in terms of, in general terms, if they were attacking a non-aligned, more neutral state, that perhaps states in which they operate, you know, might not necessarily have an axe to grind with. I would think there may be that they're taking the heat off themselves. It may be that they've made a decision to say that, for argument's sake, the extorted is not going to pay. So therefore, they still can monetize this by virtue of selling the records on the dark web. It's still quite a lucrative. There's so much data out there that the price of these records is dropping in the marketplace, but in general, it's still quite a lucrative form of additional pay to the business model. So I'd make a general posture to say that they do it for a business reason, and the business reason generally may be expediency. It may be that they've transgressed the line. A lot of these ransomware providers make sure that their software does not attack the states in which they operate. So quite specifically built into the engineering of the software is to look and see before we attack, just in case there's, inadvertent deployment or collateral damage deployments, that they don't attack the environments that are ambivalent to them or that they operate in, because obviously that brings heat on them. So they may be general, I'll make the point, general speculation. Yeah. I have no knowledge as to why they would have
Mr.
done
Larkin,
it in the case of HSE.
By giving the keys back, does it change the game in terms of the HSE? Does it change the game in terms of, in some way, securing data back within the HSE system itself? Does it assist?
It's still slow. It's not instantaneous. I think where it would definitely assist is if there was data compromised for which there was no viable backup. Then if those keys are not a trick or duplicitous, then you have potentially a model here by which you can recover data that is not accessible otherwise. In terms of the restoration process, by default, the technology that these guys provide is slow, particularly where this is done on scale. So there's still a recovery rebuild process that will have to be undergone anyway. And I suppose it's a way off as to whether restoring the data from backup, assuming they're viable and accessible backups, is more efficient than decrypting the systems in play. In most cases, it won't be a simple job of just simply decrypt and restore systems.
And being cynical, is it a way of the pariahs, the cyber pirates, letting the HSE know the level of data that they have secured? So, for instance, the HSE can look within this key and they'll be aware from the key the level of data that the criminals have been able to take from the HSE system.
In general, again, I'll be general, I would not think that would be a motivation. I would think at this stage, most organisations with good investigative powers would have determined what is left and probably would have assumed that the crown jewels have left at this point. It would be a good general assumption, particularly if these organisations have been in a long time and have done the appropriate surveillance. So they probably have got what they would want. In general terms, I'm not talking specifically HSE. And I don't think that providing the keys would do that. I think providing the keys in general terms, not specific to this, I think is a business decision to perhaps take the heat off, or maybe you could go to the goodness of humankind to say maybe there was an unintended consequence of crippling a national health system and they're trying to roll back from that. That assumes these guys have conscience. I think it's better to operate that they don't, that it's strictly a business model, and that in general terms would not be the business model. I think the business model might be to take heat off them in the sense of doing a good job, being seen to do a goodwill, but still monetize. I mean, they still have to deliver on what they say they're doing here. The threat still has to stand in general terms for their business model to work. So the threat of either, the data being inaccessible or the threat of leaking, for their business model to be credible, they've got to deliver on their threat. Otherwise, it's a false threat.
And do you think they can still deliver on their threat, Mr. Larkin?
Again, in general terms, if there is healthcare data liberated, it is valuable to the criminals that use it. So I suppose in general terms, if a ransom is paid, their business model doesn't stand up if you pay a ransom and that data is subsequently liberated. In general terms, I suppose if you don't pay ransom, then in general they won't deliver on the encryption keys. In this case, it seems that they have, again with caution. But I suppose in general terms, if a threat stands of that data being leaked, then for their business model to stand up, they need to deliver on that threat.
Okay, thank you. I would like to thank our witnesses for attending today's engagement with the committee, Mr. Larkin, Mr. O'Reilly, Ms. Carlin, Mr. Walsh and Dr. Byrne. We'll no doubt this is something we'll follow up with you again and your colleagues. So the meeting is now adjourned. The next meeting, joint committee, will be a private meeting of the committee at 12:30 this afternoon.